You're sitting at a family dinner. Could be Thanksgiving, could be a random Sunday, and someone, probably an uncle or an older cousin, leans across the table and says, with this very confident look on their face, renting is just throwing money away, right? And everyone at the table kind of nods, like it's just a known fact, like gravity. Like the sky is blue and renting is a waste, and that's just how the world works. And maybe you've heard it so many times that you've started to believe it yourself. Maybe you're in your late 20s or early 30s right now, looking at your monthly rent payment, doing this mental math where you imagine all that money just evaporating into thin air, going into your landlord's pocket, building their wealth instead of yours. It feels wrong. It feels like you're losing. Like everyone who bought a house is playing the game correctly and you're still reading the rule book in the parking lot. I've been there. I spent years feeling vaguely guilty about renting, like it was a moral failing rather than just a housing decision. My name is Sam, and honestly, I've spent an embarrassing amount of my life obsessing over money. Not in a Wall Street aggressive portfolio kind of way, but more in a why do some financial decisions feel obviously correct, but turn out to be quietly terrible kind of way? That question has pulled me down so many rabbit holes. And the rent versus buy debate? It's one of the deepest rabbit holes I've ever fallen into. Because here's the thing, and this is what I want you to sit with for the next few minutes. The math on homeownership is way more complicated than your uncle is letting on. And in a significant number of situations, probably more than you think, renting is not just acceptable. It's genuinely the smarter financial move. We're talking roughly 70% of the time, depending on the market, your timeline, your financial situation, and a handful of hidden costs that nobody seems to talk about at the dinner table. So by the end of this video, I want you to walk away with something real. Not just a, well, it depends shrug, but an actual framework for thinking about this decision. One that cuts through the noise, challenges some deeply held beliefs, and gives you the confidence to make the choice that's actually right for your life. Because that's what this is about. Not what your uncle thinks, not what society says you should want. What actually makes mathematical and personal sense for you? Let's get into it. The myth of throwing money away. Let's start with the accusation itself. Renting is throwing money away. You've heard it. I've heard it. It's probably the most repeated piece of financial advice in the history of dinner table conversations. And look, I get where it comes from. When you rent, you pay money every month, and at the end of it, you own nothing. The landlord keeps the asset. You walk away with receipts. On the surface, that does look like a raw deal. But here's the thing. Nobody mentions in that same breath, when you buy a house, especially in the first several years of a mortgage, you're also throwing money away. You're just doing it in less obvious ways. Think about mortgage interest. When you take out a $400,000 mortgage at, say, a 7% interest rate, and if you're buying right now in 2026, that's not an unrealistic number, your monthly payment might be somewhere around $2,600 to $2,700, okay? Sounds manageable, right? But here's the part that makes people uncomfortable when you actually show them. In your very first payment, something like $2,300 of that is going toward interest. Pure interest. Only maybe $300 or $400 is going toward the actual principal, toward the part of the house you actually own. You are quite literally throwing money at the bank every single month, and it stays that way for years. Because of how amortization works, you spend the first decade of a 30-year mortgage paying mostly interest and barely chipping away at what you owe. So the idea that buying automatically means you're building equity while renting means you're wasting money, That's not wrong exactly, but it's so incomplete that it might as well be wrong. Now add property taxes. In the US, depending on where you live, that could be anywhere from $3,000 to $15,000 a year just in taxes. Add homeowners insurance, another $1,500 to $3,000 annually. Add maintenance, which financial planners typically estimate at 1% to 2% of the home's value per year. So on a $400,000 home, that's $4,000 to $8,000 a year in maintenance costs. And that's not counting the surprise expenses, the things that break at the worst possible time, the roof that suddenly needs replacing, or the HVAC system that gives up in August. When you rent, your landlord handles all of that. You pay your rent. That's it. And the money you save, icky, or the flexibility you keep, has real quantifiable value that almost never makes it into the rent versus buy conversation. The opportunity cost nobody talks about. Here's where it gets interesting, and this is honestly the part that changed how I think about this whole debate. When you buy a home, you don't just make a monthly mortgage payment, you also make a down payment. We're talking typically 10% to 20% of the purchase price. On that same $400,000 home, that's $40,000 to $80,000. That money leaves your hands on day one. It goes into the house. It's locked up in the walls, basically. Now, here's the question nobody asks. What else could that money have done? If you had taken that $80,000 down payment and invested it in a simple, boring index fund that tracks the S&P 500, which over long periods of time has historically returned somewhere between 7% and 10% annually, what would it be worth in 10 years? In 20 years? At 8% annualized returns, $80,000 becomes roughly $172,000 in 10 years. In 20 years, it's over $370,000. And that's before you add anything else to it. This is called opportunity cost. It's the value of what you didn't do with your money because you chose to do something else with it. And in most financial conversations about real estate, it's basically invisible. Nobody at the dinner table says, well, sure, your house went up in value. But what about what your down payment could have earned if you'd invested it instead? This doesn't mean renting is always better, but it does mean the comparison isn't rent $0 wealth built versus buy all the wealth built. It's a much more nuanced picture than that. There's actually a concept called the price to rent ratio that real estate economists use to get a rough sense of whether it makes more financial sense to buy or rent in a given market. You take the purchase price of a home and divide it by the annual rent for a comparable home. If the ratio is below 15, buying tends to make financial sense. Between 15 and 20, it's a gray zone. Above 20, renting is often the smarter move. In a lot of major U.S. cities right now, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Miami, even Austin, that ratio is sitting above 25. In some neighborhoods, it's pushing 40, which means from a pure numbers standpoint, renting a comparable home and investing the difference is beating homeownership in those markets by a significant margin. The flexibility premium. Okay, I want to talk about something that's a little harder to put a number on, but is absolutely real, and that's flexibility. One of the sneaky ways that homeownership costs you money is through immobility. When you own a home, moving is a massive financial event. You've got real estate agent commissions, still hovering around 5% to 6% of the sale price in many markets. Closing costs when you buy the next place. Moving expenses. The emotional and logistical weight of the whole process. All told, buying and then selling a home within 5 years almost certainly means you've lost money because you haven't had enough time for the home to appreciate enough to cover those transaction costs. And this matters because life is unpredictable in ways we consistently underestimate. Think about how many people bought homes in, say, 2019, planning to stay for 20 years, and then a global pandemic completely reorganized their priorities. Or people who bought in one city because of a job, only to get an extraordinary opportunity somewhere else 2 years later. Or people who bought a home that was perfect for their life at 30 and discovered it was completely wrong for their life at 35. Different relationship status, different family size, different commute. Renters can respond to those changes with relative ease. A lease ends, you move, your life continues. Homeowners face a much more complicated, expensive calculus every single time life throws them a curveball. I have a friend, and I'm not going to name him obviously, who bought a home in a suburb outside of a major city because it was the smart financial move. 2 years later, his company went fully remote and he could have moved anywhere in the country. But he felt trapped. Not because of anything dramatic, just because the friction of selling and buying again was so high that he stayed somewhere he didn't really want to be for 3 extra years. That's a quality of life cost, and I'd argue it has a financial value too, even if it's hard to quantify. The flexibility premium of renting, the value of being able to move relatively freely to respond to the life as it actually unfolds, is real money. It's just money that shows up as avoided costs and captured opportunities rather than a number on a spreadsheet. When buying does win. Now, look, I want to be honest here because I'm not trying to make a one-sided case. That would be intellectually dishonest and also just boring. There are absolutely situations where buying a home is the right financial decision. And there are markets where homeownership genuinely builds wealth more effectively than renting and investing. So let me walk through when buying actually wins. First, time horizon. If you are planning to stay in one place for 10 years or more, the math starts to shift meaningfully in buying's favor. You've had time for appreciation to compound, you've paid down a meaningful chunk of principal, and those transaction costs get amortized over enough years that they stop being a killer. Second, forced savings. This is a real psychological phenomenon, and I don't want to dismiss it. A lot of people, if they rent and invest the difference, don't actually invest the difference. They spend it. A mortgage functions as a forced savings mechanism. Every payment, a portion goes toward equity, whether you feel like saving that month or not. For people who struggle with saving discipline, that automatic wealth-building mechanism has genuine value. Third, low price-to-rent ratios. If you live in a market where homes are relatively affordable compared to rents, parts of the Midwest, certain southern cities, smaller metros, the math looks very different than it does in San Francisco. In those markets, buying can genuinely be the smarter move from day one. Fourth, leveraged appreciation. Here's something renters don't have access to: the ability to control a $400,000 asset with $80,000. If that home goes up 10% in value, you haven't made 10% on your $80,000. You've made $40,000, which is a 50% return on your down payment. Leverage amplifies gains. Of course, it also amplifies losses, which is how people ended up underwater in 2008. But in a stable or appreciating market, that leverage is powerful. So yeah, buying can win. The point isn't that renting is always better. The point is that buying is not automatically better, and the conditions under which it beats renting are more specific than the conventional wisdom suggests. The 5-year rule, and why it matters. There's a rough rule of thumb that financial planners often use. The 5-year rule. The idea is that if you're not planning to stay in a home for at least 5 years, you probably shouldn't buy it. The transaction costs alone, agent commissions, closing costs, title insurance, all of it, typically runs somewhere between 8% and 10% of the purchase price when you add buying and selling together. You need time for appreciation to at least offset those costs before you can claim to have built wealth through home ownership. And honestly, 5 years might be conservative in high cost markets. Some analyses suggest you need closer to 7 or even 10 years in major metros before buying reliably beats renting. Here's the uncomfortable truth: the median American moves every 5 to 7 years, which means the average person is right on the edge of that break even point, or possibly inside it, every single time they buy a home. They're not building the kind of long term wealth they imagine they are. They're treading water on the transaction costs, maybe coming out slightly ahead on appreciation, and feeling like financial geniuses because the number on Zillow went up. This isn't me being harsh. I genuinely believe most people are making these decisions in good faith, with incomplete information. Because the real estate industry, frankly, has a vested interest in you believing that buying is always the right move. Real estate agents make money when you buy and sell. Mortgage brokers make money when you borrow. Nobody in that ecosystem is incentivized to tell you, actually, in your situation, renting for another 3 years might be smarter. The emotional dimension. Okay, I want to take a small step sideways here because I think we'd be doing this whole conversation a disservice if we pretended it was purely about math. It's not. Not even close. Homeownership carries a massive emotional weight in our culture. It's tied up with ideas about stability, success, adulthood, belonging. When people say, "I want to own a home," a lot of what they mean is, "I want to feel settled. I want a place that's mine. I want to stop worrying about a landlord raising my rent or telling me I can't paint the walls." And those are completely legitimate desires. Genuinely. A sense of stability and control over your living environment is not a trivial thing. Research consistently shows that homeownership is correlated with community involvement, better outcomes for children, and higher life satisfaction. Some of that is probably correlation rather than causation. Wealthier, more stable people are more likely to buy homes and also more likely to have those outcomes. But some of it might be real. The point is, there are non-financial reasons to buy a home that are valid. If owning a home would meaningfully improve your quality of life and sense of security, and you can genuinely afford it, that has value that doesn't show up in a rent versus buy calculator. But, and this is important, don't confuse an emotional desire with a financial fact. Don't tell yourself that buying is the smart financial move when what you mean is that buying would make you feel more stable and happy. Those are different things. One is true, the other might not be, depending on your market and situation. The most honest version of this conversation acknowledges both. Yes, home ownership has real non-financial benefits. And yes, in many circumstances, it is a worse financial decision than renting and investing. Holding both of those things at the same time is more useful than pretending either one doesn't exist. The real estate appreciation illusion. Let me hit one more number that tends to surprise people. When you adjust for inflation, the long-run average appreciation of residential real estate in the United States is somewhere around 1% to 2% per year in real terms. Not nominal, real. Meaning after you account for the fact that money itself loses value over time. The economist Robert Shiller, who literally won a Nobel Prize partly for his work on asset prices, tracked U.S. home prices going back over 100 years and found that after adjusting for inflation, homes appreciated at an average of about 0.6% per year over that entire period, less than 1%. Now, there are obviously exceptions. Coastal cities, certain high-demand urban markets, periods of rapid population growth. In those places, appreciation has far outpaced inflation. And if you bought in San Jose in 1990, you made an extraordinary amount of money. But that's survivorship bias at work. We remember and talk about the cases where real estate made people rich. We don't talk as much about the vast middle of the country where homes appreciated roughly in line with inflation for decades, and people dutifully paid their mortgage and came out more or less fine. Meanwhile, the stock market, over comparable long periods, has historically delivered real returns of around 7% per year. That's not a small difference. Compounded over 20 or 30 years, the gap between 0.6% real appreciation and 7% real investment returns is enormous. We're talking potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in final wealth, depending on the amounts involved. Again, this doesn't mean renting is always better. Real estate has that leverage component, and for many people, the forced savings aspect is worth a lot. But the idea that real estate is this reliably spectacular investment that beats everything else, that's mostly a story we tell ourselves. The data is more nuanced, a practical framework for your decision. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. I want to give you something concrete you can actually use. Here's a simple framework for thinking through whether buying or renting makes sense for you right now. Start with your time horizon. Are you confident you'll stay in this city, in this general stage of life, for at least 7 to 10 years? If the honest answer is no, or even probably not, that's a serious flag. Transaction costs alone make short-term buying a losing proposition in most markets. Next, check the price-to-rent ratio in your specific area. Find a home you'd want to buy. Find a comparable rental. Divide the purchase price by the annual rent. If that number is above 20, you're in territory where renting and investing the difference often wins mathematically. Then, honestly assess your investment discipline. If you rent a cheaper place and save the difference versus a mortgage payment, will you actually invest that money? Or will it quietly disappear into lifestyle inflation? Be honest. If you struggle with saving, the forced savings mechanism of a mortgage might actually make homeownership worth it for you, even when the pure numbers say otherwise. Consider your opportunity cost. What would your down payment do if you invested it instead? What returns could it reasonably generate? How does that compare to the expected appreciation of the home you're looking at? Finally, and this one is often skipped, calculate the full cost of ownership, not just the mortgage. Add property taxes, insurance, estimated maintenance, use 1.5% of home value as a baseline, HOA fees if applicable, and the amortized transaction costs of buying and eventually selling. Compare that total monthly cost against your rent. The gap might surprise you. If after going through all of that, buying still comes out ahead, or if the non-financial benefits of ownership are significant enough to justify a modest financial disadvantage, then buying might genuinely be the right call for you. There's no shame in making a decision with full information. There's just a lot of unnecessary financial stress in making it without. The culture around homeownership and why it's hard to shake. I want to spend just a minute on why this myth is so persistent. Because we've laid out all this data, and yet the dinner table conversation doesn't change. The advice from parents and uncles and well-meaning colleagues doesn't change. Why? Part of it is generational experience. For the baby boomer generation, home ownership was genuinely spectacular. They bought homes in the 1970s and 1980s in markets that subsequently exploded. They experienced firsthand what it felt like to buy a house for $100,000 and sell it 30 years later for $800,000. That experience lodged itself deep in the cultural memory, and it got passed down as universal truth even though the conditions that made it work, low price to rent ratios, falling interest rates, rapid suburban expansion, were specific to that era. Part of it is psychological. Owning a home feels like winning, it feels stable. Renting can feel emotionally like impermanence. And in a culture that equates home ownership with adulthood and success, renting can carry this faint stigma that's hard to shake even when the math says it's the smarter choice. And honestly, part of it is that the real estate industry is one of the most powerful lobbying forces in the country. The mortgage interest deduction, the capital gains exclusion on home sales, the constant cultural marketing of home ownership as the American dream, none of that is an accident. There are enormous financial interests aligned with keeping you believing that buying is always right. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, I'm just saying follow the incentives. When everyone in an industry tells you their product is obviously the right choice, it's worth asking who benefits from you believing that. So here's where we land. Renting is not throwing money away. Buying is not automatically building wealth. The truth is somewhere more complicated, and honestly more interesting than either of those bumper sticker statements. The hidden math of homeownership includes mortgage interest that eats most of your early payments, property taxes, insurance, maintenance costs, transaction costs, and the opportunity cost of a locked-up down payment. When you actually add all of that up, in roughly 70% of market conditions and life circumstances, renting a comparable home and investing the difference outperforms buying from a pure wealth building standpoint. That said, buying absolutely makes sense when your time horizon is long, your market has a reasonable price to rent ratio, your appreciation outlook is strong, and the forced savings mechanism matters to you. And there are non-financial reasons to own a home. Stability, autonomy, community, that are real and worth weighing. What I want you to take from this is not a conclusion. I want you to take a habit. The habit of actually running the numbers specifically for your market and your situation rather than defaulting to cultural consensus. Because the decision to rent or buy is probably one of the largest financial decisions you'll make in your lifetime. It deserves more than your uncle's opinion and a vague sense of guilt about your monthly rent check. You are not behind. You are not losing. If you're renting right now and putting money into savings or investments, you might actually be playing this game better than most of the people who feel certain they're winning it. The real wealth is in understanding what you're doing and why. Everything else follows from that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.